Well, we're back and take a look who's here. Here's Mel again. Mel just cannot stay away because he's doing so much good work. Every time that Mel emails me, he says, Jay, I found something new. Jay, I've got some more material. Jay, I want to come on. Let's do something. Let's do another recording. So here we back again. And the reason Mel's back is because he's been watching these episodes that we've been doing on Günter Lüling and Gabriel Sauma, and also that Murad has been doing, and also the ones on Christoph Luxemburg, but especially on Günter Lüling. He really liked what we did with what Thomas and I did earlier, Thomas and Alexander. And it's good because we want to spend time with Günter Lüling. We want to spend time with these guys who've gone ahead. Mingana, as we now know, is the one that really was the first to open this up. Alphonse Mingana out of Birmingham University, who was a Syriac scholar himself, so that's why he understood and was picked up on this much quicker than the rest. Salma is another one who's a Syriac scholar. It's his native tongue, and that's why he's been able to pick up much quicker than the Germans have. But the Germans have been ahead of the field. And one of those that we have been really highlighting is our good friend Günter Lüling. Günter Lüling, who we asked you all to buy this. Thank God you bought so many of them that they had to now come up with a new reprint. This one here just came out a few, 1 or 2 months ago, here in 2022. Now, what Günter Lüling did, and it was good to have Thomas Alexander kind of correct me on that. It's not that he went back and found the Aramaic text. He just found Christian hymns. But he assumed that these Christian hymns were still in an archaic form of Arabic. And that's why he took off the diacriticals and put on the same diacriticals, but found different letters, different words to recreate a totally, to actually go back to the original creation that now made sense of these beautiful hymns, like in chapter 96. Mel over here has been looking at this, and he's going to introduce today what not so necessarily what Günter Lüling did, but how almost all of these, if you take a look, almost all of this that we see in the Quran today has been borrowed from other sources, and some of it has been borrowed from Ethiopic sources. And Mel, you've come across an article, haven't you, that you have found looking at Surah 5, and you're going to introduce it. Now you're going to show us how dispels this whole notion that this is something that's eternal, that is uncreated, that has always existed in heaven. No, what we're finding over and over again is everything that's in the Quran has been pilfered, has been borrowed, excuse me, maybe I shouldn't say pilfered, but has been taken from other texts, incorporated into the Quran, and sometimes has damaged the original text, as we saw certainly with Surah 96, and as we're going to see in Surah 23 and Surah 70, that's yet to come. So go ahead, Mel. Help us work us through this. What is that you're finding with Surah 5? And especially it's one word you're going to look at. You're going to zero in that one. We're going to let you introduce it to get us up and running, to see just how all of this comes from man-made documents, sometimes in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, sometimes in Africa, sometimes up north. But it was all put together at a much later date without giving credit to where credit was due. Over to you, Mel. Help us with this, and let you take it from here.
Okay, so Jay, I think a key word here that is helpful is the word intertextuality. So, sometimes in that clumsy way, we sometimes imagine that the Arabists are basically copying a text straight over, but very often what they're doing is they're borrowing words here and there, borrowing ideas, and they're putting their spin on it. So intertextuality is the term for that. So they would argue, I think if you were to talk to those writers back in the 7th, 8th or 9th century, whenever we would like to say they were writing in, they would probably say, well, we're not stealing anything. All we're doing is we're taking something, we're perfecting it, we're adding our own ideas, and it's fair game. They're doing what a folklorist might do. They take a bit of like a folk song and they add their little twist to it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. So what I'm focusing here is on one specific word in the Quran, which is from Ethiopic, or Ethiopian, as we might more commonly say. What evidence is there that Ethiopian texts may have been used in the Quran? The presence of Ethiopic words in the Quran is a long acknowledged fact and is a huge clue as to how the Quran was constructed. And the paper that I'm referring to today is by Manfred Kropp. His paper is called Beyond Single Words. He's been researching this topic since 2002, and I would say he is the main expert when it comes to Ethiopic currently. So he gives this quote in his paper. According to G.S. Reynolds, the Arabic words injil, gospel, Ma'idah, table, are likely Arabized forms of the Ethiopic words Wangel, itself derived from the Greek evangelion, meaning gospel, and Ma'ed, meaning banquet or table. He goes on to say that now it is evident that the loan words are the best and clearest indicators of influence, but even these have not been really studied exhaustively. Many questions have been left open, even in the magisterial study of Noldeke and those of his followers. So he's really one of the few people that's been delving into the Ethiopic side of things, and he's really surprised how little other scholars have looked into this. Even if we cannot tell whether these words were already current in pre-Islamic Arabia before Muhammad's time and before his message, these terms form a special layer of the vocabulary expressing religious concepts in the core of that message, with special emphasis there on that last part. If we can say and decide that they are definitely Ethiopic and not, let us say, Aramaic, Syriac and so on, or at least that they have not arrived directly from these spheres, then we will have an important statement about possible religious and cultural influence. Now, what's evident with Manfred's paper is he assumes a lot of the standard Islamic narrative. He's not really questioning that, but he still recognizes that these words are being borrowed from other cultures and texts and so forth. And it shows a familiarity with not just different languages, but different scripts as well, as we'll see later. So it's a question of intertextuality, not a direct borrowing of Christian texts. He says, not all of this I would necessarily agree, but in any case he says, in this volume, Bowring rightly points out that still today we cannot precisely identify textual parallels in the Qur'an and Jewish or Christian texts. Instead, we have only loose or vague allusions which point to a rich oral transmission to Muhammad of the concepts and contents of foreign texts, not to a direct contact by reading or reciting those texts. And he goes on to say, in the 3rd century AD, Ethiopia was exerting military and political force in Yemen. It established garrisons and stable settlements in the Tinhama. Probably the Ethiopians never left Yemen again until the time of Abraha, the Ethiopian but independent ring of Yemen of the middle of the 6th century and the subsequent Persian invasion some decades before Islam. When it comes to the question of Ethiopic influence, one has first to consider an important fact. Ethiopia is first Christianized by a Lebanese man, merchant son of Tyre. The Ethiopian church formally and juridically depended on the Patriarch of Alexandria, but most of the important and influential missionaries came from Syria and Palestine. So we can see here there's a flow between all of these countries. There's a flow coming from Syria and Palestine, and ultimately the flow of influence is going back to Syria and Palestine when it comes to the writing of the Qur'an. The same region also heavily influenced adjacent Arabia. As a result, it can be difficult to decide if a given word or a given influence came directly from Syria, Palestine, or via Ethiopia to Arabia. Now, what's really cool about this paper is that he's able to answer the question of whether this word that we'll look at came directly from Syria, Palestine, or via Ethiopia. And I think, as you'll see, he proves it fairly conclusively that it came via Ethiopia. At any stage, if you want to jump in, Jay.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on one thing that you said, and we're going to get into this Ethiopic, but what is fascinating, and people will probably be saying, well, hold on a minute, how could this guy, if he's making these suppositions, how does he still stand and hold on to the standard Islamic narrative? And I think we have to remind people that an awful lot of the scholars that we're using, they have to maintain that stance. In order to retain their salaries, in order to protect the chair that they may be holding in an academic institution, or even to support the institution that they represent. So don't expect them to come to confront the standard Islamic narrative. They're not interested in that. What they're doing is they're chipping away at the margins. They're chipping away around it, but still holding to that thesis. We don't hold to that thesis. We don't need to. However, why Mel is using is not because of whether he stands or folds or holds to the standard Islamic narrative, the Islamic traditions. We're looking for him to see what is it and where did these antecedents, where did these influences come to the Quran? And whether or not, like he believes it was Muhammad that wrote the Quran or that this came from Central Arabia, just take a look, and as you're going to find and see, everything he's going to be talking about, everything Krupp refers to, either happens way down in the south in what is today Yemen and Oman, or off to the west, which would be Ethiopia, or way up in the north in Syria and in Lebanon. Nothing that he says actually takes place in Saudi Arabia, in the what we know as the Hijaz. Notice that's a huge hole that he doesn't want to talk about. He refuses, but we can. We can. So just so people don't get confused, because we're going to get some kickback and say, aha, see, Kropp disagrees with you. He accepts the standard Islamic narrative, so why don't you?
The other thing as well is he kind of assumes that there's this Muhammad who's illiterate and he's getting all these ideas from some oral tradition.
Yeah,
But,
absolutely. And
but
every
the problem is,
Muhammad is not illiterate. He would not have had any chance to read any of this material. In order to borrow it, you have to be able to read it in those languages. So that's what's more
yeah.
interesting. How would he have known to read Ethiopic or Aramaic or Syro-Aramaic or Nabatean Aramaic? He would not have known to know that, because if he came from the central part of Arabia, none of these existed that far at the central part of Arabia.
And we're dealing with someone who's apparently has got familiarity with three different scripts. I don't know many illiterate people who can look at three different scripts. I can barely manage an English script, never mind going into, Russian script or Arabic script or, any of the others. It's for me, it's difficult, and I'm reasonably well educated, and yet we're supposed to believe an illiterate person is able to pick up on these ideas, different languages, different scripts. It's a no-brainer that this story doesn't add up to me.
Great point. Thanks for that.
No. So the key word is Maida or Maida. This has no etymological explanation in Semitic. It's found in Surah 5, 112 and 114, and it's a clear borrowing from Ethiopic Ma'ed'a, with the meaning table or dishes or banquet. As usual, for the words for table in these languages, it is a foreign word having no etymological explanation in Semitic. He goes on to say that the etymon is most probably Vulgar Latin or Koine Greek. Megiddo or Megiddo is table or plate of wood, silver and so on in those languages, only rarely attested in literature. The translators of the Ethiopic Bible replaced consequently Tarapeza by Maida, thus following the general guidelines for early Christian Bible translators to use a popular, generally understood language, not necessarily a literary one. So I got some additional information from a viewer who sent me this on my channel, which was very helpful, because I was wondering about the fact that the writer of the paper, Mr. Kropp, Manfred Kropp, he wasn't sure if it was Latin or Greek that it came from. So I got this extra little bit. Elan says none of the words for table in Arabic are native. We have the Arabic tawila, table, comes from the Latin tabula. So Arabic ma'ide, table, definitely has the giz or ma'id as cognate, either a direct loan or through a South Arabian language. The source of this word is contested, and so he goes on to say that it could be either the Latin megida, which he translates as kneading trough, so that's a place where you take the dough and you basically knead it, or the Greek megida, and it's similar meaning, kneading trough or small table. The accusative Greek form of the word is the source of the Latin word, so that's his take on it. But based on etymology alone, it is impossible to tell if Gies got it directly from Greek or through Latin. But the key thing is that it was first in Ethiopic before it was introduced into Arabic for the Qur'an. And Surah 5 is given the title Ma'idah, which is quite interesting considering there's no Arabic etymology to the word, but there is if you go into Ethiopic, Greek, or Latin. And I suppose the key point there is Megiddo became first Ma'idah when the Bible was being translated into Ethiopic. Now, if we look at Surah 5, there are 4 references to light in, and I'm going to just reference 2 of those. You can see there, a light from God has come to you, and another one is He brings them out of darkness into light. And we find the 2 references to Ma'idah, which what's interesting in terms of this translation that I've used from the internet, the same word Ma'idah has been translated in 2 different senses. Both senses are found in the Latin, Greek, and Ethiopic, which is table or feast. So we can see here in Ayah 112, they've translated it as, is your Lord able to bring down for us a feast from heaven? Whereas in Ayah 114, send down for us a table from heaven. So it seems to me that the translators of the Quran into English were aware of these 2 meanings. That would suggest that they're drawing that word from Ethiopic and Latin and Greek, and they're not getting those meanings from Arabic itself, because there's no etymology in Arabic. He goes on to say that at the end of this paper I will present a passage taken from an Ethiopic homily which breathes the atmosphere of the Quranic text, that's Surah 5. So where he gets it is the homily of John, Bishop of Aksum in Ethiopia, and there's the reference from where he got it. This has been translated into English for the first time back in 1898, so it's relatively unknown. Not a lot of people have heard of this homily. And here it is. We can disregard the part that's in brackets. I believe that's a description of the homily, but the homily is underneath. So it says, every time they came together at the table, Ma'idah, lights descend on them shining like the sun. They tasted food only at dawn in the morning, and on the Sabbath, on Christmas, the day of his birth, and on the day of Epiphany. On the day of the miracle of Cana, they did not taste food except the Eucharist, flesh and blood of Christ. And on Easter and Pentecost, they ate only 3 grapes of wine. It's clearly a Christian text. Well, you'd expect so. It's coming from the homily of a bishop of Aksum in Ethiopia. But the question is, why is Surah 5 drawing from this source of all sources? It goes on, angels descend to tell them to disband, that each of them might search his own region to preach. The angels are welcomed in the saint's house. And when they had completed the washing of the feet of the angels and had drunk the remaining water, they sat for meal, and the light appeared as usual. When they had finished the table, Ma'idah, they heard a voice coming and calling on them. Angels were visiting them. They had visions of our Lord until they were capable of resurrecting the dead, healing the lepers by their prayer, as well as making the blind see, and the lame walk, and the deaf hear. Thus they performed many miracles, and the lights as usual kept descending from heaven on their table. Thus they stayed for 13 years. Now this is a homily. The impression I get from this is that this was a real event, and it's a miraculous event, and caused a bit of a stir, and obviously as a result the Bishop of Aksum wanted to share this with the other Christians. I was looking at the idea of the miracle, which supposedly is a light shining down on the table where the monks are gathered around, and I found a modern day example of something like this. As I say, I can't confirm if this is a real miracle or not, but at least we get an impression of what we're talking about here, a light shining down during a religious service. So the homily continues. Then a monk came to them named Malkianos, who did not know any other work than women's hairdressing. He made his living out of that. He did not sit at their table, and he ate his bread alone. Thus they rebuked him, but thereafter these lights departed from them and shone above that monk. Now, I think the pretext there is that the other monks looked down at this other monk, they felt that they were better than this monk, and this monk, presumably because of the association with having worked as a woman's hairdresser, they might have thought maybe he was effeminate or something like that. But the light then shone on that monk as well. The saints then asked, "Where are our lights that used to come down from heaven on our table? Why are they now hidden from us?" The monk answered them, "My masters, today this light is shining upon me." At this moment they understood and said, "That happens because we have rebuked this monk." They embraced each other, wept bitterly for 40 days and nights, and then they departed separately, each one in his new region. So there's a lot in that homily. I can imagine why it would be spread. Lots of miracle stories, amazing sort of events with a moral to it. The idea that Christians shouldn't judge each other and never kind of second guess what God's intentions are. I don't know if you want to jump in on any of that, Jay.
Yeah, this whole thing with this from Bishop of Axum in his homily here. This must be the source for that. And you can see why it was very popular. Not only, as you say, did it talk about the miracles, but it's also also a great moral story. The idea that we're all equal. That doesn't matter what kind of job we do. Doesn't matter what kind of environment that we're in. There's no difference between man, woman, Jew or Greek, slave or free. We are all equal in Jesus Christ. So you can see why this then became popular, and then this would be the influence for that word itself as it was brought over.
Okay. Now, so what are the implications of this and other findings, like the Syriac sources that have been mentioned in other videos? The Quranic writers are working with multilingual sources, clearly. They are also familiar with at least 3 scripts: Aramaic, Arabic, and Ethiopic. Here are some examples of what each of those look like. So on the left here you have Ethiopic. It is very similar to Sabaic, which is a Southern Arabian script. So you can imagine if someone had some experience of reading scripts way down in Southern Arabia, they could possibly read a text from Ethiopia, especially that's a homily from the Bishop of Axum. On the right, we see an example of Syriac script. This one here comes from the 11th century. So what I think is happening here is that the writers of the Quran are familiar with 3 different scripts. You have the Aramaic script, you have the Arabic script, obviously, and you have the Ethiopic script, which is down here. If you compare the South Arabic script, or the Sabaic script here, which is the second from the bottom, and compared to the Ethiopic script, in almost every case the letters are identical. So I can imagine if someone came from South Arabia, they could manage to read an Ethiopic script, and so therefore it tells us quite a lot. The fact that there's Ethiopic words in the Quran tells us quite a bit about the writers, that they have some link with Southern Arabia, if not Ethiopia itself. I thought it would be interesting to draw a quotation from Odin Lafontaine's book, The Great Secret of Islam. If you remember, his idea was that the project of the Quran was that there were Judo-Nazarene propagandists, and they were trying to get people to see Christianity the way they view things, if you like, and they were also translating a lectionary into Arabic. So I'm just going to quote from him. He says, "Judeo-Nazarene propagandists, Aramaic-speaking Jews, many of whom knew liturgical Hebrew, explained their texts to the Arabs. Moreover, they trained Arab preachers, translated their texts into Arabic, and taught them. To do this, they produced for them small manuals, anthologies of the main texts of their Torah, their gospel, their customs, their laws, their rites of purity, their food codes and prohibitions, their circumcision. The most important 8 memoirs consisted of translations into Arabic of the lectionaries used by the Judeo-Nazarenes themselves. A lectionary is a liturgical book which presents readings and commentaries on sacred texts, as Christians always do." Now, if Odin is correct, and I believe he's pretty much on the money on this one, it makes perfect sense if they were translating biblical passages into Arabic to consult other translations that have been done. And in the 6th century, the Bible was translated into Ethiopic. So it would make sense to look at how that was translated when translating into Arabic, and maybe use some of the religious vocabulary to fill the gaps, because Arabic didn't have ready-made words in place that they could use. So I would suggest that this is a big clue to what is going on. In this translation work, they had a ready-made example in the Bible translated into Ethiopic in the 6th century. This probably was helpful in the difficult task of translating lectionaries into Arabic, especially as much of the vocabulary didn't exist in Arabic and needed to be borrowed. And one of those words would be Ma'ida. So if we look at this image here, you can see that way up in the north is where we believe the Quran had been written. The material of the Quran was written somewhere in the red rectangle, possibly in multiple locations. We simply don't know. This was where people were bilingual in Aramaic and Arabic in the 7th century. So it makes sense that what we find in the Quran is some sort of a hybrid between both languages. Now that would be something that Luling didn't see, but it would have been something that Christoph Luxemburg picked up on. One of the writers had links with Yemen, may possibly studied there, such as that he was aware of the homily from Aksum in Ethiopic, and possibly knew the Ethiopic Bible as well. So I'll hand it back to you, Jay.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. I want everybody to look at this map here. There's the rectangular at the top there. That is where the Quran, we do know it was written up in that area because it has Syro-Aramaic, has an Nabatean Aramaic, it has many other antecedents. All of them exist in that area of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and today Lebanon and Israel. So that's where the Quran, we know, was put together. That's where all the manuscripts are derived from. So why is it that they would have Syriac? Well, that's where the Syriac is spoken. Why would they would have Aramaic? Well, that's where Aramaic was used. What about Ethiopian? Remember what we've been saying all the way along, that all of the trade came from India and China, came across the Arabian Sea, could no longer go up through the Persian Gulf because of the warring parties between the Sassanians and the Byzantines. So that shut down the Persian Gulf. They had to be redirected down through the Gulf of Aden, up through Eritrea. Remember, it was always Agilis, the city of Eritrea, where they always stopped. All the traders stopped in Agilis, and then they went up the Red Sea. They never went to Arabia because there's no water there. We've said this so many times. Where there's no water, there is no food. Where there's no food, there are no people. Where no people, no towns, no cities, no civilization, no history. They did not go on the eastern side of the Red Sea. They went on the western side. What's on the western side? Ethiopians are. That's where the Guz was spoken. So anybody trading and we know that all the trade went up to Petra and then from there to the Mediterranean. So all this trade going back and forth between Jordan and India and China would have all had to go through Ethiopia, all had to go through what is today Eritrea and Agilis. That's how they came across these texts. That's how you had the cross-pollination. It's not that they had themselves to go there. All the trade was coming through there, all the people. And so the trade have traders, and the traders would be taking these texts with them. And they would also be using these words like Maida coming out of Ethiopic. So to me, that makes perfect sense. It fits exactly with what we've already found.
And I think another point I would say is the fact that there's only a tiny percentage of Ethiopic words shows us that it wasn't written down in Yemen, even though there's a few words there. The majority of the foreign words we find is way up in that red box. So we can eliminate the idea that it was written down in Sana or somewhere like that, just that there was that influence. And I think that trade route idea that you just mentioned makes perfect sense. All it takes is for someone to bring a Bible on a ship way up into Petra.
Remember,
and
you did say
into
that the Bible was translated into Ethiopic in the 6th century. That's 100 years earlier. It could be even 200 years from what the manuscripts are showing us. So in that 200-year period, it had made it was been used. Especially if you stop and think, if Agilis controlled the trade, then Agilis were the ones, the people from Agilis, which is Ethiopian. They would be the ones going to Petra. They would be the ones taking the material with them. They would have Bibles with them. Those Bibles would have been used, and also they would have been cross-pollinated because with different phrases, different words, and in this case, even a homily could easily be lifted from those Bibles, from those texts, and been used in what we now know as the Quran today.
Yeah, and actually, I think something else that I would say there. In terms of the Quranic project, they were interested in two things. They were interested in translating a lectionary, but they were also interested in delivering homilies to the preachers. So it makes perfect sense for them to borrow some ideas from a homily from the Bishop of Egypt, as well as to borrow the vocabulary from the Ethiopic Bible, because it makes more sense not to reinvent the wheel. If someone has already gone to the great effort of translating the Bible into Ethiopic, and you're now trying to translate from the Hebrew and the Greek into Arabic, it makes sense to try and use as many sources as possible. And this would be a text that they could read, because many of them would be familiar with the Sabaic script, which was very popular right up into the 6th century. It was, in fact, for the southern half of Arabia, for about 1200 years, the Sabaic script was where it was at, whereas what was originally an Aramaic script that evolved into the Arabic script, that was still relatively new. So the southern script you would expect would be the one that at least most Arabs would have been able to read. So I think it makes a lot of sense now.
Especially if the traders use that script and they were using it in their commerce. If they're using it in commerce, they would have to know it. Then it would be a simple step then to say, all right, just like we do today. Many of us who go around the world, we have to learn many different languages if we're going to be able to communicate. English today is now the lingua franca that's used worldwide. Back then, if you're a trader and you're coming up from, you control all the trade that's coming from India and China, you would be using Sabaic, you would be using Ethiopic. So it stands to reason that these stories, and we do that even today. We take great stories coming from other different parts of the world. That if it's a great story that lifts and helps us understand what the Bible is saying or what Jesus is preaching, you take those stories and you reproduce them in your own stories. And then you also hand them on. You borrow them and you make sure others read them. That's what's going on here. And so it looks like they've just borrowed a great story. They didn't really think through the fact that maybe this was something that was created in Ethiopia or in Agilis or that part of the world. They just said, this is a great story. It's about this miracle that happened, and here's a great homily that talks about a terrific moral story. You would use it. You would not necessarily even give credit to where it comes from, but you would certainly use the word that is used in it in that homily to reproduce it.
Do you know what the greatest irony of them using that homily is? Every part of that homily completely contradicts Islam, because it's all about Jesus.
It's all about Jesus. You're right. And isn't it fascinating how we seem to always coming back to that same conclusion? Now, certainly, Mel, we're going to get some feedback. I'm sure we're going to get some, maybe even kickback. But again, it's just proving that so much of the Quran has been borrowed from so many different locations, and we can even trace them back, go back even to the word, in this case, one word that actually pinpoints where it was probably borrowed from. Making sense at that part of the world, up there in the north, where they're pulling together many different fragments, many different stories, many different homilies, many different hymns, and many different lectionaries from many different sources, into putting them into what then became the Quran, this book that we have in our hand today. Possibly not, certainly not in the 7th century, more likely in the 8th to 9th century. Any last word you want to say before we head on out?
I think this is just the beginning. I think we're going to discover so much more. I'd like to just point out something that I said to you a year ago. I said 2022 is going to be the year of the Aramaic, and it's turning out that way. We keep seeing so many sources that are coming from the Aramaic, but we've extra bits. We've got Ethiopic now, and there's going to be an awful lot more that we're going to discover.
Yeah, next we're going to be looking at chapter 23 and chapter 70 to prove exactly your point. Thanks a lot, Mel. Thanks for coming on board. Terrific, people. Again, if you have any comments, right there, down in the right below is the box where you can actually put your comments. Do comment, and let's see where we can go from here. This is Mel and Jay, thousands of miles apart. Over and out.